Eleanor of Aquitaine, the powerful queen, the fierce duchess, the legendary matriarch behind two kings of England, her story is practically a medieval fairy tale, or so you've heard, because here's the real headline. Almost everything you've ever imagined about her life is a lie. The dazzling courts, the legendary love affairs, the sweeping power, illusions. The truth is, Eleanor's crown came wrapped in iron chains. For nearly 50 years, she was a prisoner, locked away not just by her ruthless husband, King Henry II, but shockingly by her own son. Think about it. A queen, once the most powerful woman in Europe, reduced to staring at frostbitten walls, begging for scraps, listening to the drip of cold water in a stone cell, day after endless day. This isn't a tale of royal splendor. It's a descent into betrayal, suffocation, and heartbreak. Imagine it, Eleanor locked in towers where the air reeked of mold, denied sunlight for months, her every word and letter censored by suspicious guards loyal to her enemies. Sometimes those enemies were her own flesh and blood. Picture the thick, icy fog pressing against ancient castle walls, the scratch of rats in the corners, the taste of stale bread rationed out by men who'd once bowed at her feet, betrayed, isolated, erased. That's the legacy no one talks about, but you're about to hear it, because this is the true story, not of a queen's glory, but of her 50-year living burial. Today, we tear open the darkest secrets of the Plantagenet dynasty and reveal what royal love really cost when kings treated queens as pawns, not partners. You're about to witness the most relentless, shocking chapter of the Middle Ages, the story of the queen imprisoned by her husband and her son. Her gilded cage was a tomb. Everyone remembers that Eleanor of Aquitaine was the wife of Henry II, the great Angevin king. Their union was supposed to form an unstoppable empire. England, Normandy, Aquitaine, all under one iron-fisted dynasty. The cliché? She was the jewel of the medieval world, at the heart of the most glamorous court in Europe. But here's the monstrous reality. Behind those glittering palace doors, Eleanor's freedom shrank year by year, until her court became nothing more than a collection of damp, suffocating rooms. You won't hear this in romantic tales, but the castles chosen for her imprisonment weren't just remote. They were picked for their cruelty. Far from any friendly face, cut off from her allies, Eleanor's world grew small. Her only company, the silence, the chill, and the mocking laughter of guards who saw her as a traitor. And as the years dragged on, the opulence of her youth faded, replaced by the sour smell of neglect and the constant fear of poison or assassination. The queen who'd once decided the fate of nations was forbidden to even see the sun. The betrayal that shattered a dynasty. History loves to talk about Eleanor as a powerful queen, even a troublemaker who shaped her sons into kings. Yes, Henry II and Eleanor had children, future rulers, legendary warriors. The story most people swallow? She raised heroes. But the ultimate betrayal wasn't from some distant enemy, it came from the man who'd promised her the world. When Eleanor dared to side with her sons in rebellion against Henry, she wasn't just punished, she was annihilated. Henry ordered her arrested, stripped her of titles, her properties, her voice. But here's the savage detail. Her jailers weren't strangers. They were men she'd handpicked, now sworn to break her spirit. Every letter she wrote was intercepted, every visitor a spy, and the horror only escalated. History books gloss over this, yet Eleanor's confinement was so total, so absolute, that at times she went months without news from the outside, not even allowed to see her own children. Imagine the loneliness, the gnawing terror that you've been erased from the world, and there's no hope of return. Her power, her legacy, her family, gone, replaced by the taste of betrayal. The son who became her jailer. It would be almost comforting to think Eleanor's nightmare ended with Henry's death. But the story gets darker. Richard the Lionheart, her beloved son, the legendary crusader. He could have set his mother free. He owed his throne to her. But even Richard, caught in the web of power, saw his mother as a liability. What happened next was pure treachery. While Richard's reign did bring her a brief glimpse of freedom, it was always conditional. Guards remained. Letters were still monitored. Sometimes she was shuffled from castle to castle. A queen in name only, her world no larger than the next damp corridor. You won't hear this in the legends. Richard used his mother as a bargaining chip, threatening to lock her away again if she stepped out of line, leveraging her life against rival lords and scheming barons. The unbreakable bond between mother and son shattered, replaced by suspicion, manipulation, and cold political calculus. For Eleanor, freedom was just another word for a more comfortable cell. Decades in the silent dark. You might ask, how could one woman survive so many years, cut off off from the world she once ruled. Eleanor endured not just the physical horrors of her captivity, but the crushing, slow suffocation of hope. You won't hear this in the legends, but the castles, Old Sarum, Winchester, and more, were notorious for their isolation and brutality. Thick stone walls, tiny slit windows, no warmth but a smoky, choking fire. Guards chosen not for their mercy, but for their loyalty to Henry's vendetta. She was denied books, music, visitors, even the comfort of a priest at times. Food was sparse, often stale. The only thing more relentless than the cold was the silence, broken only by the wind howling through cracks in the walls. Modern historians believe that Eleanor's legendary rebellion was not just political, it was the final scream of a woman who'd been cornered, ignored, and slowly erased by the men who were supposed to love her. The most powerful woman in Europe was reduced to a shadow, forbidden to feel the sun on her face. 50 years, the slow death of a queen's spirit. Now here's the punch that history refuses to throw. Eleanor's prison wasn't just built of stone, it was built of time. Imagine, 30 years in, her body aging in a cell while her sons grew up, grew hard, grew distant. 40 years, her allies dead, her enemies multiplying. 50 years, her name little more than a rumor, her fate unknown to almost everyone outside those walls. Even after Henry's death, true freedom never came. Her own children saw her as a threat, not a mother, but a pawn to be moved, silenced, used. The horror of it isn't just the iron chains, it's the decades of silent despair, the extinguishing of hope, one breath at a time. Here's the chilling truth. When Eleanor finally emerged, the world she'd once ruled was gone. The castles, the courts, the armies, different, colder, ruled by men who remembered her as a whisper, a warning, not a woman. The vibrant queen, the cunning diplomat, the patron of poets, replaced by a still, weathered figure, eyes hollowed by endless winter nights, fire replaced by a haunted, chilling calm. So there it is, Eleanor of Aquitaine, not just a queen, but history's most shocking royal prisoner, betrayed by her husband, betrayed by her son, sacrificed to the brutal machinery of power for half a century. Was Eleanor a victim of monstrous men, or a casualty of a system where even queens were disposable? What does her story really tell us about the true price of medieval power? Let me know below, because this isn't just ancient history, it's a warning written in stone in silence. If this story of betrayal and royal imprisonment shocked you, imagine what other dark truths history hides. Smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. We tear down the myths and expose the raw, unfiltered past every week. And next time, we descend even deeper into the even more sinister fate of another queen who dared to defy her king. Trust me, you haven't heard true horror yet. Eleanor's story, even now, presses against the edges of what we imagine possible for a queen. Think of her, born in the sun-drenched courts of Aquitaine, where poets sang of love and honor, where the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and spilled wine. She grew up believing she would shape kingdoms. Instead, she became a lesson in how power devours its own. Her so-called gilded cage was colder than any battlefield, more merciless than any enemy army. But how did this nightmare actually begin? The seeds were planted with a marriage, a deal struck in cathedrals and whispered in candlelit chambers. Eleanor, once married to the King of France, was traded like a prize to Henry, a man hungry for an empire. Their union was a match made for conquest, not love. At first, she was his equal, advising on strategy, commanding respect, even riding into battle. Yet with every triumph, Henry's suspicion grew, and so did his need to control. Eleanor's charisma, her independent mind, her alliances with her sons, all of it became a threat. The man she had once shared a throne with now watched her every move, fearing she would turn his own blood against him. And then she did. It's easy to call it rebellion, but when Eleanor encouraged her sons to rise against their father, what choice did she really have? She was already caged, her influence poisoned by Henry's paranoia. The so-called Great Revolt of 1173 wasn't a power grab. It was the desperate gambit of a woman whose voice had been stolen, whose sons were being twisted by a father's iron grip. But the cost? Catastrophic. The rebellion failed, her sons were broken, and Eleanor herself was hunted down like a traitor. Henry ordered her seized, not with ceremony, but with brute force. Stripped of her entourage, separated from her children, she was hustled under cover of night to a fortress far from any who would defend her, and that's when the real sentence began. What most people never grasp is just how calculated her captivity was. Henry didn't want her dead. Dead queens become martyrs. He wanted her erased, alive but powerless, her name fading from memory, her stories silenced. At first, she was shifted from castle to castle, Salisbury, Winchester, Sarum, places chosen not for comfort, but for maximum psychological torment. You won't hear this in the storybooks, but the guards who watched her were handpicked, loyal to Henry, sworn to report every sigh, every muttered prayer, every attempt at communication. Letters from her daughters were intercepted, burned, or rewritten before they reached her. When she begged for a confessor, Henry sometimes refused, fearing she might confess more than sins. At Christmas, when the world outside feasted and rejoiced, Eleanor sat alone in her cell, listening to bells toll for a world that seemed to have forgotten her. And all the while, Henry made sure to remind his subjects that the Queen's absence was necessary, that she was ill, or unfit, or resting. Anything but the truth. The woman who'd once presided over the most celebrated courts in Europe was now spoken of in whispers, as if she were already dead. But she wasn't dead. She was waiting. Decades passed. The guards changed. The stone never softened. Her children, Richard, John, Geoffrey, came of age without her. They visited sometimes, allowed brief, monitored meetings, but each visit was another blade. Sons grown tall, faces hard, hearts changed by years of absence and suspicion. Richard, her favorite, the Lionheart, inherited more than her courage. He inherited her enemies and her prison. When Henry finally died, racked by paranoia, abandoned by allies, Eleanor must have believed for a moment that her ordeal was over. But history is rarely so kind. Richard, now king, freed her. On paper, he paraded her through England, showed her off as the Queen Mother, the living symbol of Plantagenet legitimacy. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and Eleanor, cloaked in royal robes, smiled through tears. But it was all a mask. For even as she rode through her realm, she knew she was not truly free. The men who had once feared her power now feared her memory. Richard needed her as a symbol, not a partner. He granted her estates, but kept her under watch, her movements restricted, her counsel limited to what served his interests. Freedom, for Eleanor, was just a bigger cage. And when Richard left for crusade, the wheel turned again. With the king gone, England was a cauldron of plotting nobles, rival claimants, and simmering resentments. Eleanor, left behind to govern, was really left to absorb the hatred of men who saw a woman, even an old one, as a threat to the order of things. Some begged her for mercy, others tried to manipulate her, but all watched her as if expecting the queen to rise again and burn the world. The pressure never let up, the eyes never closed. You won't hear this in romantic legends, but as she aged, Eleanor's body began to betray her. The cold gnawed at her bones. Old wounds, untreated for years, ached in the winter. The beautiful, poetic queen became frail, her voice thin but still dangerous. Some say she took comfort in letters from the nuns of Fontevraud, her last sanctuary, a few lines of scripture, a memory of sunlight on the stones. But the world she had built, the dynasty she had sacrificed everything for, was dissolving in blood and rivalry. By the time her youngest son, John, snatched the crown after Richard's death, Eleanor was nearly spent. The boy she had once held in her arms now held her fate in his hands. He needed her counsel, but he feared her too. At every turn she was reminded she would never be more than a tool for others, never more than a reminder of how power destroys its favorites. This was the true horror, the slow, silent, unending erasure of a woman whose only crime was being too great for the men around her to tolerate. 50 years, a lifetime lost to shadows, to suspicion, to stone and silence. And so, the final years of Eleanor's life flickered away, haunted by memories, burdened by losses, and overshadowed by the ghosts of the very dynasty she had forged in fire. Imagine her now, no longer the dazzling young duchess, but an old woman, wrapped in heavy wool, hands twisted by age and cold, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond her window bars. The taste of freedom was always tinged with dread. The world outside those walls changed with every decade. Kings rose and fell, crusades thundered east, new tongues and fashions swept through her former courts. Yet Eleanor remained locked, not just by iron or stone, but by the unyielding suspicion of her own blood. Picture her at Fontevraud Abbey, the last of her sanctuaries, moving through candlelit corridors where her footsteps echoed off ancient stones. Here, among the nuns and the dying, she was free, but only because she no longer posed a threat. She had outlived almost everyone she had loved or feared. Her legendary sons, Richard, now dead from a wound in battle, and John, the unpredictable, spiteful king, carved up the last shreds of her legacy. Even her grandchildren grew up under the shadow of her exile, inheriting not her power, but the cautionary whispers that trailed her name. Yet the ultimate horror wasn't the length of her captivity, or even the betrayals that kept her there. It was the transformation, the slow burial of a living woman. The Eleanor who once shaped the fate of Europe, who negotiated treaties, rallied armies, defied popes and kings, was erased by time, reduced to a warning, a relic, a story told in candlelight to frighten or inspire the next generation. Even the abbey where she died became a monument not to her achievements, but to her survival. The vibrant queen was gone. In her place, a weathered figure with secrets carved into every wrinkle, a spirit battered by decades of cold neglect. Here's the detail that should chill you. When Eleanor finally died in 1204, she was buried at Fontevraud beside Henry, the man who had made her world both magnificent and unbearable. The chronicles wrote her epitaph as a saint and a peacemaker, but those who knew her remembered something else. They spoke of the fire that once blazed in her eyes, now banked into something quieter, deeper, sadder. 50 years of captivity, and yet she endured. But at what cost? The world she had shaped barely remembered her true self. The courts she had built no longer echoed with her laughter or command. Instead, her story ended in silence, a warning to every woman who ever dared to wield power in a world built to punish queens who would not be tamed. So there it is. Eleanor of Aquitaine, remember her not as just a queen or a footnote to powerful men, but as history's most shocking royal prisoner, betrayed by husband, betrayed by son, sacrificed to the brutal machinery of power for half a century. And now, the question is yours. Was Eleanor a victim of monstrous men or a casualty of a system where even queens were disposable? What does her story tell us about the true price of medieval power? Drop your thoughts below. Let's pull back the velvet curtain and talk about what history refuses to say out loud. And if this story of betrayal and royal imprisonment shocked you, just imagine what other dark truths history still hides behind its polished myths. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Here, we dig up the bones, shatter the fairy tales, and show you the raw, unfiltered past every week. Next time, get ready to descend even deeper, because we're exposing the even more sinister fate of another queen who dared to defy her king. Trust me, you haven't heard true horror yet.